Córdoba is one of those cities that seems to contain several civilizations at once. Walk through it today, and you can feel Roman stone underfoot, Islamic geometry overhead, Christian bells in the air, and the memory of a Jewish quarter still woven into the streets. That is what makes Córdoba more than just a beautiful Spanish city. It is a place where power changed hands repeatedly, where architecture became a political statement, and where memory is still contested because so much history is layered into the same space. UNESCO describes its historic center as the product of Roman, Visigoth, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian occupation, each leaving a mark. The story begins long before the famous red and white arches. The Romans founded Córdoba near an earlier settlement in the 2nd century BC, and under Augustus, it became the capital of Baetica, one of the most important provinces in Roman Spain. It was not some remote outpost, it was a serious urban center, tied into imperial power, trade, and intellectual life. The city produced figures like Seneca and his family, which tells you that Roman Córdoba was already connected to the wider world of ideas and influence. After Rome, Córdoba passed through Visigothic rule, but the real transformation came in the early 8th century. Muslim forces took the city in 711 or 712, and by 716, Córdoba had become the provincial capital of al-Andalus, under the Umayyad system linked to Damascus. That change mattered enormously. Córdoba was no longer simply an old Roman city surviving into a new age. It was now positioned to become one of the great capitals of the Western Islamic world. Then came the figure who changed everything, Abd al-Rahman I. He was a survivor of the Abbasid overthrow of the Umayyads in the east, and after a dramatic escape, he reached Iberia, seized control in 756, and made Córdoba the capital of his new emirate. That decision turned the city into the center of an independent political project. This was not just a refugee finding safety, it was the deliberate rebuilding of Umayyad prestige on new ground. In 784 to 786, Abd al-Rahman I began the construction of the Great Mosque of Córdoba, a monument that announced both continuity with the Islamic world and the creation of something distinct in al-Andalus. Over the next 2 centuries, the city expanded in wealth, complexity, and ambition. The mosque was enlarged several times. Suburbs grew around the old core. Crafts, scholarship, and court culture flourished. Under Abd al-Rahman III, the stakes rose again. In 929, he proclaimed himself caliph, making Córdoba the head of an independent caliphate. That was a huge claim, not just locally, but across the Islamic world, because it placed Córdoba in direct symbolic competition with other centers of power. Around this new status grew a court culture of immense sophistication, and just outside the city rose Medina Azahara, a palace city built from the mid-10th century as a seat of caliphal rule and a display of power. By the 10th century, Córdoba had become one of the most important cities in Europe and the Western Mediterranean. Britannica describes it around the year 1000 as the largest and probably the most cultured city in Europe. Whether you frame it that boldly or a little more cautiously, the point is the same. Córdoba had become a major center of government, religion, architecture, and learning. This was the city's high point, and for later generations, it would become the source of endless fascination and nostalgia.
But great cities are often most vulnerable at their peak. Córdoba's golden age was real, but it was not permanent. The same concentration of wealth, prestige, and political authority that made the city shine also made it fragile. Once caliphal power weakened, Córdoba became the prize in a much wider struggle. In the early 11th century, civil war shattered the Caliphate of Córdoba. The state broke apart, and with it went the stable authority that had made the city the unquestioned center of al-Andalus. Medina Azahara, built as a symbol of triumph, was sacked and abandoned during this era of collapse. That collapse is one of the most important turning points in the city's history. Córdoba did not simply vanish, but it ceased to dominate. Instead of being the capital of a unified caliphate, it became one power center among many in a fragmented landscape of Taifa kingdoms, rival dynasties, and shifting alliances. This is where the myth of Córdoba can become misleading. People often picture its Islamic age as one long, uninterrupted golden century. In reality, it was a period of extraordinary achievement, followed by political disintegration. The beauty survived more easily than the power did. Then came another decisive change. In 1236, Ferdinand III of Castile captured Córdoba during the Christian reconquest. The great mosque was converted into a cathedral, and the city was drawn into the political and religious world of Christian Castile. Yet even here, the story is not one of simple replacement. The old Islamic urban fabric did not disappear. The mosque remained standing but repurposed. Later Christian rulers added their own structures, including the Alcázar de los Reyes Cristianos, while the city's existing layers continued to shape its identity. UNESCO notes that the mosque was converted in 1236 and that later Christian defensive and civic works reshaped the city around it. One of the most striking chapters came in the 16th century, when a Renaissance nave and transept were inserted into the center of the former mosque. Work began in 1523, and those additions gave the building its extraordinary and sometimes controversial dual identity: mosque and cathedral, Islamic monument and Christian church, one structure carrying two grand traditions at once. This is one reason Córdoba remains so visually powerful. It does not present history in separate buildings far apart from one another. It compresses history into the same walls. The city's Jewish history also remained part of that layered landscape. In the Jewish quarter stands the Córdoba Synagogue, built in 1314 to 1315, one of the best preserved medieval synagogues in Spain. Its survival matters because it reminds us that post-conquest Córdoba was still home to multiple traditions, even as the balance of power had changed sharply. Later, the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 would close another chapter, but the building remained as evidence of a community that had once been part of Córdoba's urban life. So the central truth of Córdoba is this: the city did not rise once and fall once. It kept changing roles. Roman capital, Umayyad emirate, caliphal metropolis, fragmented post-caliphal city, Christian stronghold, and through all of it, the physical cities stored the memory of each transition. What makes Córdoba so compelling now is not just the greatness of one period, but the way later ages kept reinterpreting it. Some remember it mainly as the jewel of al-Andalus, a symbol of Islamic Spain at its most brilliant. Others emphasize the Christian reconquest and the cathedral that still functions inside the old mosque. Others point to the city as a meeting ground of cultures, though that phrase can sometimes smooth over real tensions and inequalities that also shaped the past. Córdoba survives in memory because every generation finds a different meaning in it. That is also why its monuments matter so much. The Mosque-Cathedral is not just a tourist landmark, it is an argument in stone about continuity, conquest, adaptation, and preservation. The Roman bridge still links the city across the Guadalquivir. The street plan of the old quarters still carries traces of older worlds, and Medina Azahara, rediscovered and excavated after centuries of burial, preserves the ambitions of the caliphs in ruined form. UNESCO inscribed the mosque first in 1984, extended protection to the wider historic center in 1994, and later inscribed the Caliphate city of Medina Azahara in 2018. If we strip away the postcard version, the real history of Córdoba is more interesting than any simple legend. It was not merely tolerant paradise, nor merely a battlefield of religions, nor merely a museum of vanished empires. It was a living city, shaped by power, wealth, ambition, faith, scholarship, and conflict. Its rulers used architecture to project legitimacy. Its prestige depended on political success. Its decline came when that power fractured, and its afterlife came from the astonishing fact that so much of its past remained visible. Córdoba also raises timeless questions. What makes a city great? Military power, Wealth, learning, beauty, or symbolism? Can a building belong fully to more than one history? What happens when a place becomes so famous that later generations stop seeing its complexity? Those questions are why Córdoba still works so well as a historical story. It has spectacle, but also interpretation. It has grandeur, but also fragility. It has pride, trauma, reinvention, and memory. In the end, the history of Córdoba is the history of a city that kept becoming something larger than itself. Rome made it provincial capital. The Umayyads made it a Western imperial center. Civil war reduced that supremacy. Christian conquest changed its official identity but could not erase what came before. And the modern world turned it into one of Spain's great heritage cities precisely because its layers are still there to be read. That is why Córdoba matters. Not because it fits neatly into one civilization's story, but because it shows how civilizations overlap, compete, and leave traces in the same place. And few cities in Europe make that truth feel more immediate than